The JFK assassination is called the mother of all conspiracies. There's so many things that could have happened, and there's so many stories from the people that were there. Today, we learn about some of those new stories as we learn more about the JFK assassination. Thanks for listening and subscribing to Learning More. It is Russ with you. And well, okay, I've hosted various podcasts. For about a year and a half, I did a daily history podcast called This Is Today. Now, I've since stopped doing This Is Today, and because it was just a little too much work to do on a daily basis, as you could imagine. But if you ever listen to that show, you would notice that I mentioned JFK a ton. Why? Well, okay, super interesting. Right? The whole assassination, the mother of all conspiracies, as they call it, made it very, very interesting to learn more about JFK, right? Why am I so interested in this? Well, here's the thing. Television news wasn't big prior to this. Radio news wasn't even that big. People got their news from the newspapers, but because the events were happening so quickly, on the day of the assassination, people turned to radio and they turned to TV. And well, as a kid, that's what I wanted to do. Now, I wasn't around during the JFK assassination. I was not born yet. And I did, however, know of people like Dan Rather, who really was just as he says, a cub reporter back on the assassination day. I knew of Walter Cronkite. I knew of these greats, and I tried to study them as much as possible because, well, that's what I wanted to do as a kid. So yes, I was like a middle schooler, and I'm looking up stuff about Walter Cronkite, like, going to the library because we didn't have YouTube back then. So the assassination, and for me, specifically the media coverage surrounding it, has always been something that I have been interested in. I'm excited to have an author of a book about the assassination where she talks with people that might not have actually been talked to yet. It's very interesting. Katana Zachry is joining me today on the show. Katana, thanks for joining me today and helping us learn more about the JFK assassination.
Thank you for having me.
It's interesting to have a book out there. By the way, I should mention the title of the book, The Lone Star Speaks, Untold Texas Stories about the JFK assassination. So what inspired you to write this book?
I particularly was inspired. I have a co-author, Sarah Peterson, and she was interested in this also, but she's a little younger than I am, so she doesn't have the personal memories of the assassination that I do. My grandparents lived in Dallas when Kennedy was killed. My grandfather was one of those Dallas oil men that, people are still criticizing and some blaming for their part in the assassination, as they say. And so they saved all the Dallas, Fort Worth, and area newspapers for me just because they were so historical. Mm-hmm. And even, I was only 11 at the time, even as an 11-year-old, it didn't take long to realize that stories were changing from issue to issue and that one person's quote might be left out entirely in another news story. And often these quotes were from people who were very important, the Parkland doctors, the eyewitnesses there at the Dealey Plaza. And since I was always interested in journalism too, I couldn't understand why the stories and the quotes kept changing. And then after I read the Warren Report in 1964, I looked back at the newspapers and sometimes I would realize, now, wait a minute, this isn't what this person originally told this reporter. And I had to wonder, how did the stories begin to change and why?
Do you think it was just false memories, the time, the forgetfulness, or was this, in your opinion, people actually changing these quotes?
Well, I'll give you an example. An FBI agent named Elmer Moore had admitted later on that he had orders from the FBI, which meant which meant J. Edgar Hoover, to talk to Dr. Malcolm Perry, the main doctor who worked on John F. Kennedy, and tell him that his first impression that wound in the throat was an entry wound was totally wrong, because that did not match up with the Warren Commission's results. And so if an agent is saying, I was ordered, and he said, I feel bad that I had to kind of come on pretty hard, twist his arm to get him to change his story, then that tells you he wouldn't have been. In fact, he said, well, I wasn't the only agent who was told to pressure people into changing their stories.
And now that's the FBI. There's also conspiracies about the CIA being involved. There's conspiracies about it just being an accidental misfire by one of the Secret Service agents. That's one of the conspiracies. There's the Umbrella Man. There's Fidel Castro. There's a lot of theories out there around this. And what's your theory on it?
Well, first of all, we did look into the interesting book, Mortal Era, which claimed that the Secret Service agent who was riding in the backup car accidentally, hit Kennedy.
Right.
I think the photos that we were able to find do not show anyone else in that car reacting to what would have been a very loud gunshot.
Right.
I don't think there's any way they could have not reacted. So I think that's the best evidence you have the man did have the gun. He was standing up on the back seat, which was very risky. And yes, that could have happened in a scenario, but there's no evidence that backs it up.
Right. And well, what about some of these other theories? Like, the Umbrella Man, the person that opened his umbrella, and people say that was signaling multiple shooters to kind of, when Kennedy was in the right spot and they were triangulating, the spot, and the umbrella was to send the signal. What about that theory?
Another man that we interviewed was a man named Tosh Plumley, and he has told for years that he was on what is often referred to as an abort team. Actually, it was an intervention team. And we discovered another intervention team made up of U.S. Marshals who were also there. And so this tells you immediately that people were aware that there was going to be an assassination attempt, or you wouldn't have sent the military and the U.S. Marshals to try to prevent this. Now, Tosh Plumley said that the man who is sitting next to the Umbrella Man was part of his intervention team. And the reason he sat next to the Umbrella Man is because the Umbrella Man was suspicious looking. No one else is carrying an umbrella, so he does stick out like a sore thumb. But he said, when you're part of an intervention team, you don't go with the idea of we're going to start shooting anyone who looks suspicious, because you're going to hit innocent bystanders. He said, what you do is find someone who looks suspicious and you plant yourself right next to that person. And he said, you're come dressed like a tourist, dressed like a businessman, anyone who wouldn't stand out. And then you plant yourself next to those people so they would not dare do something. So the Umbrella Man may honestly have been there trying to, make Kennedy think that the umbrella represented Neville Chamberlain and his father's attitude that we shouldn't get involved in World War II. I don't know. That sounds kind of crazy, but that doesn't mean somebody wouldn't have done that. But regardless, thanks to that man sitting next to the Umbrella Man, he wouldn't have been able to do anything harmful with that umbrella one way or the other. And that's what an intervention team does.
Because some even say that the umbrella was a disguised weapon, right?
Yes, R.B. Cutler came up with that idea, and he has since passed away. And it was an interesting one until someone like Tosh Plumley tells you one of our men was sitting right next to him to make sure, even if he'd wanted to hit Kennedy with the umbrella, which he probably could have, I wasn't going to let that happen. So there's no evidence that was ever a weapon of any sort.
So, as famous as the Umbrella Man is, the more famous person that is perhaps a part of these conspiracies is Johnson himself. A lot of people
Yes,
believe that Johnson was the one that orchestrated this. What's your thoughts on that?
that's a very interesting idea. And there is a great deal of evidence that at least indicates Johnson covered this up. I mean, I don't think there's much doubt about that. I'll tell you what, the Assistant Attorney General of Texas was named Robert T. Davis, and he was one of the first people we interviewed. He was sent by the Attorney General, Wagner Carr, to Dallas to help with the Warren investigation. And so, as an attorney, he got to sit in on interrogations. He got to ask questions. He saw exactly how things operated. After 3 months, he had just had more than he could take. He went back to Austin and he told Wagner Carr, he said, "This is the biggest whitewash I have ever seen." And then he added a little sentence, "Lyndon Johnson is running everything anyway." So that tells you there's no question that Lyndon Johnson was covering up a lot of what happened. Now, there have been books written saying he literally was the mastermind. Phil Nelson is a friend of ours, and he collected tons of evidence that would show why Johnson would have wanted Kennedy dead. The problem is he wasn't the only one that wanted Kennedy dead. People were coming out of the woodwork who had a grudge against Kennedy. Like you said, the CIA, the Cuban anti-Castro Cubans who were upset with him about the Bay of Pigs. But Lyndon was, had as much motive as anyone to want him dead.
Yeah, that's one of the things about this is there's so many potential people that are pulled into this from foreign governments like Cuba or even Russia. There's a lot that of conspiracies about just everyone that's involved with this. I've heard even like some of the journalists. It goes everywhere. And the thing is, there's a ton of stories though out there, and that's what your book is pulling in, is stories from people that those stories may not have been told. Tell us what you learned by putting together the research for this book.
Well, one thing we learned is that there's no doubt the Camelot mystique was created after Kennedy was killed. His administration was really nothing like Camelot, I think, if you really examine it. The man had a great many fallacies when it came to risky behavior. He had terrible health problems that his whole family and his staff and administration covered up. But he also had some character flaws when it came to risking national security to have affairs with a woman, for example, that was also sleeping with mafia chief Sam Giancana, or to have affairs with like Ellen Remish, who they had to pay to get her back to Germany because, anyone would have thought she might have been sent as a double agent. There were just lots of people who just realized that the Kennedy administration wasn't as wonderful as it was mythicized later. Mm-hmm. But our point was, I don't think that's how you get rid of a president. If you're unhappy with him for whatever reasons, we have a way to vote someone out of office. And so often the question was asked us, Kennedy had so many vulnerable areas. Why didn't they just reveal some of this to the journalists? And let's face it, that would have been the end of him.
Right.
Well, first of all, some of the journalists were his good friends who would not have printed this. And at the time, you weren't supposed really to print personal things about presidents and things of that nature, unlike today. Secondly, if Kennedy's peccadillos had been revealed, the Democratic Party would have been damaged also. So you can imagine that the whole Democratic Party didn't want this to happen. So that's why some of this just didn't get revealed so that he could simply be unelected or not reelected in 1964. Secondly, there were so many people, and our question in the book is, if you have a great many people who normally do not get along, but they have a common goal, would they work together to get rid of someone? Would the mafia work with the CIA? Obviously, they did. Would the mafia work with the FBI? Would you have some Secret Service agents who might have been so disgusted by having to bring prostitutes into the White House that they would have worked with a group saying, maybe this is the only way to keep this man from being reelected? And the answer to that is probably yes, that various groups worked, and some of them independently of each other. Plausible deniability means I don't get caught because I don't know anything about this part of anything. So we think there was probably a group of people who financed this, another group who implemented it, a group who covered it up, but they all worked together without knowing who each other were. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, do you think, because there's a whole other thing here, right? Of like, there's a ton of conspiracy theories around this. There's a ton of different ways to look at the assassination. And then you sort of have the crazier things in there, like, you know, the Illuminati being involved or aliens even being involved. I've seen, you know, all these weird conspiracies. Do you think that those things are thrown in the mix to try to make everybody that's researching this and every other idea seem like, oh, well, you know, the alien thing can't be true, so neither can this? It was just, you know.
Doesn't that make sense? That if you try to throw in disinformation, it's going to make that real revelation seem stupid also.
Right, right.
Why does the picture always show up in the front of the National Enquirer with an alien with his arm around whoever the current president is? It makes a joke out of anyone who might think, you know, we possibly have had alien life on Earth. Same thing with the Kennedy thing. You're right. Some of these conspiracies are just unbelievable. And so that throws a shadow of doubt over every theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the one that's always thrown me, and you know, I mean, there's various about that day at Dealey Plaza that, you know, I went to the 6th floor museum, a fantastic place to visit if you're interested in the JFK assassination or just JFK in general. It's amazing to go there and see how they've set this place up. They've done a fantastic job. So definitely suggest going to check that out if you're interested in this. But I went there to Dealey Plaza. There's plenty there at Dealey Plaza to wonder about. But you know, the thing that's always got me is that didn't even happen that day. It happened days later. Is Jack Ruby, and his association with the mafia and his decision to kill the assassin of JFK or the potential assassin of JFK, depending on who you talk to. But Jack Ruby's involved in this. He's the only person to actually go on trial. What's your take on Jack Ruby and his involvement in this?
Well, I have two things I'll tell you right quickly. One of them, I was at a book signing in Fort Worth, Texas this weekend, and there were quite a few police officers there, some retired, some current, and they were fascinated by the book, and so they would come up and tell me all sorts of stories. And one man came up to me and said, well, I knew Roy Vaughn, who was the Dallas police officer who was on duty on the Elm Street side of the police department, who got blamed for letting Jack Ruby walk past him. And to the day he died, under oath, he swore Jack Ruby never entered the garage from my area. Well, this man said that was a lie. He knew it was a lie. The Dallas police knew it was a lie, but he wasn't going to ruin his career by admitting, yes, I went ahead and let Jack Ruby in because we all knew him and we thought he was harmless. And I said, so he told you this personally? And he said, yes. So I said, okay, I made a note of that. And I said, do you mind if I write your name down? And he said, oh, not at all. Roy Vaughn's dead. And I said, I don't think he would even care if I told it now. So an hour or so later, another retired policeman came up and started talking about that he was on duty that day on the other side of the Dallas Police Department. And he said, I was very young and I was being very careful. We had been told do not let anyone in who is not a police officer or has certain IDs. And he said, I didn't. I was very careful. And I said, well, I just got told that Roy Vaughn did let Ruby in. And he looked at me, he said, oh, yeah. He said, everybody in the Dallas Police Department knew that. So we know, but he said it wasn't to commit a crime. He just knew him so well, and he was always hanging around the police department. He just ignored him and let him walk on by. And he said nobody was more shocked than Vaughn was when they heard gunshots. So, all the stories about him sneaking in a side entrance and some other one else letting him in, apparently, according to the Dallas police, Roy Vaughn really did do that. Now, one of the comments you made about Lyndon Johnson really startled a news announcer at WGN. We did an interview with them. And when I mentioned that Robert Davis had said Lyndon Johnson was running the Warren Commission, he nearly jumped through the TV screen and said, are you saying Lyndon Johnson was involved in killing the president? And I said, I'm telling you that Robert T. Davis said he was controlling the Warren report. And you could tell he was shocked by that. Now, another person that I interviewed was Bernie Sindler, and his godfather, as he referred to him, was Meyer Lansky. Does that name sound familiar to you?
No, that one doesn't.
He was one of the big mafia chieftains, as important as Santos Trafficante and Sam Giancana. And he told me, I talked to him by phone in Las Vegas. He was in the hospital. And I said, can you tell me anything about Jack Ruby? And he said, oh, yeah, he was one of our boys. And I said, oh, so you're saying he was connected to the mafia? And he said, oh, definitely. And I said, why did he kill Oswald? Because that's the first fishy thing that happened. Maybe everyone was accepting that Oswald had gone off the deep end because he was upset with his wife and killed Kennedy and who knows why, until Sunday, when the assassin is silenced. And that's when everyone I know began saying there's something fishy here. He said he already knew he had cancer. He didn't have a great deal longer to live regardless. And he was ordered by the mafia to shut up the assassin because they were afraid Oswald was going to talk. So he said, yes, there is no doubt Jack Ruby was connected to the mafia, and the mafia had Oswald killed. Now, that definitely connects the mafia to a certain extent to the Kennedy assassination.
Right. Now, why else, other than fear of Oswald talking, would Ruby assassinate him?
I think part of it might be that they were, of course, concerned about what Oswald might tell, who he was connected to. And if the government and the CIA were already working with the mafia, and we now have documentation that that was true in Cuba, perhaps the CIA was just as involved as far as wanting Oswald not to talk as the mafia was. So it might, the mafia got used, and their method of killing people is up close and personal, just like Ruby did. They don't normally have snipers. That you think of as CIA, military, things of that nature. But if the CIA and the mafia worked hand in hand, there's no telling how much Oswald could have told about CIA activities.
Mm-hmm.
So it might not have just been the mafia that wanted him shut up. The CIA probably did too.
So why do you think, and I mean, it's interesting to me, like I said, in the show open here, like it's something that has always fascinated me, like to try to solve this mystery, right? But why do you think we're still talking about this today?
I think because it is the unsolved mystery of the 20th century. Very few people nowadays, in relation to those that don't believe the Warren report, are still defending it because there are too many mistakes in it. And maybe they're mistakes, maybe they're errors. an author named Barry Ernest wrote a book called The Girl on the Stairs. And I was visiting with him on the telephone about some of the information he had found. The woman who disproves really that Oswald could have been on the 6th floor and sneaked down and been on the 2nd floor when the police officer and the Roy Truly, the manager or superintendent of the depository, see him, is Victoria Adams. And her story is intriguing because her testimony was changed for the Warren report. They offered to let her read it, and she trusted the government. She didn't even read what they put in there. But in the Warren report, she supposedly said that she walked down the stairs and saw 2 men, William Shelley and Billy Lovelady. And everyone knows that has looked at the time period that William Shelley and Billy Lovelady particularly ran to the grassy knoll area, spent some minutes around there, then came back. And it would have been several minutes, 15 to 20 minutes before they would have seen Victoria Adams. And when someone showed her what she was quoted as saying in the Warren report, she said, "I never said I saw William Shelley or Billy Lovelady. Somebody added that." Well, she has passed, but I called up a woman who was with her that day, a woman named Sandra Stiles. And I said, "Did you see William Shelley and Billy Lovelady when you and Victoria Adams walked down from the 4th floor to the ground floor?" And she said, "No, I never saw either one of them." And I said, "Well, you're both quoted as saying you did." So once again, we have evidence that somebody changed people's testimonies to change the time period to allow Oswald supposedly time to get down those stairs.
Right. Well, in going to Dallas and actually, visiting the 6th floor, visiting Dealey Plaza, and then actually taking that route that Oswald took after to the movie theater where he was captured, that's a long route. You need a lot of time to get there.
And you have to allow time for him to have gone to the boarding house, boarding house, and change clothes, and then come back out. And then they never could even first of all, they could not come up with a motive for why Oswald would have killed Kennedy. According to his wife, he liked Kennedy. He didn't have anything against him. Then he certainly didn't have a motive for why he would have killed J.D. Tippit. So if you think about my thinking, and Sarah Peterson agrees with me, I don't think Oswald would have ever been found guilty if they had removed him from Dallas. They should have removed Ruby, but they didn't. If they had removed the trial to another city, and with a decent lawyer, I don't think he would have been found guilty. Well, what is the government going to do then? Who else are you going to accuse when you've had it written in every newspaper in the world?
Right.
He's obviously guilty. Guilty as sin.
And what about the documents that have been released over the years? Some of those seem sort of, there's so many redactions. It seems that it's underwhelming, I guess we'll say. Some of the items that have been released. And there's still some to be released, right? Yes,
because even Biden hasn't released all of them, and I'm not sure anyone ever will. And I think what bothers them is that people who have gone through these with closely with magnifying glasses and trying to figure out what would fit under those redacted parts, and there were so many of them, it was hard, have found little mistakes that have been left. Things like Oswald's 201 file that came out finally, or things with names that suddenly fit and added a little piece to the puzzle. I think there must be something left that they are terrified somebody will put all these pieces together. And it could very well be names on documents where people have claimed they didn't even know certain things were happening. And here's a memo saying, yes, you did.
Why do you think this is being covered up? Like, what would be the reason for a cover up?
The only reason would be is that the government and possibly our own military was involved.
And I guess, I wrote down this question, right when we set up the interview. because I'm so interested in this. But why should people care? Like that's the question that I like, why should we care about this? Why should we care about resolving this and
We
figuring this
address
out?
this with every presentation, Sarah and I both, and the answer to that is because it could happen again. And if another president, whether you like him or don't like him, is assassinated and it's an inside government job, or they have allowed groups like the mafia to do it for them, are they going to cover it up? And are we going to all sit here and read whatever official report the government puts out and say, oh, well, that must be the way it happened? I mean, will it not continue if it's not ever revealed what really happened?
Right. You put together the book, and as you said, you did a book signing. People are coming up to you, adding additional stories to it. Is there anything that you've learned since you put out the book that you'd like to share?
One thing I learned just the other day, I found there was a doctor who was a medical student actually at Parkland on the day Kennedy was killed. And of course, when they heard the president was being brought there, he and another medical student wanted to be involved. Why wouldn't you? But the Secret Service wouldn't let him into Trauma Room 1. However, since they knew Parkland like the back of their hands, they're senior medical students, they knew there was a back route to the blood bank, which was right across the hall from Trauma Room 1. So they managed to get to the blood bank. And this particular doctor said, I even delivered 2 things of plasma to Trauma Room 1, thinking I might get in there to see the president. And he said, of course, I didn't, but whatever. But he said, suddenly, this very short, middle-aged woman approached me and said, I want you to tell me where the switchboard operators are. And he said, I wasn't quite sure who she was, but she had such an authority to her that I said, okay, yes, ma'am, I will. So he said, I took her to the switchboard where all the hospital switchboard was. And he said, turns out it was Lady Bird Johnson. And she told all the operators, there will be no more incoming calls. There will be no more outgoing calls from this switchboard. And they all looked at her like, who on earth are you to tell us what to do? But once again, she said it so authoritatively. She said, I mean, none. And she was very nicely dressed, that they just all looked at her and said, yes, ma'am. And that shut down the switchboards. And he said, I was about to walk away because I found her the switchboard. And all of a sudden she turned to me and she said, where do you think you're going, Sonny? And I said, well, she said, I need you to tell me where a room is where we could set up a press release, where we could have a press news report conference. And he said, is there one? And he said, well, yes, there's the rooms where we, use for classes that we can open up and we could have a press conference there. And so he said, here I am with who turned out to be Lady Bird Johnson. And I'm setting up chairs and she's telling me to do this and get this podium ready and get this microphone ready. And he said, so I get it all set up. And he said, eventually there was a press conference there. And I said, well, let me ask you, did she act like she was doing this on behalf of Lyndon Johnson? And he thought a minute and he said, no, she just took charge and knew there had to be a press conference. And there was. But what struck me as odd is that this isn't in her White House diary. She never talks about that she did this. She's not over there comforting the first lady whose husband is dying, or at that time, even talking to Nellie Conley, whose husband may be dying. She is doing the pragmatic, rational, political thing to do, setting up a press conference. And yet, Lyndon Johnson never held a press conference. I think she assumed he would.
Right.
That he would probably be announcing that, yes, the president has died and I am now the new president. And of course, the Secret Service didn't allow that to happen. But he said, I had never had any use for the Johnsons. I came from Austin. We all knew they controlled everything down there and that they were in dirty politics. But he said, my impression of Lady Bird changed tremendously. This woman knew how to take charge and she took charge. Now, my thinking was that seemed almost callous, that here the president's dying and all you're thinking about is setting up a press conference. But he didn't see it that way. He said, no,
right.
I was impressed with her authority and the way she handled things so rationally and
Yeah,
calmly.
trying to take
And I'm
charge of.
thinking, I'm impressed that her
Yeah,
thought wasn't on, my gosh, the president's dead. Her thought was in, we need to have a press conference.
right. We need
So
to.
yeah, that was something I just learned the other
That's
day.
interesting. That's interesting. Well, that's what's, great about, putting out this book is you get to, hear all of these stories because now, you were going to the research. Now research is coming to you, which
True,
is
but
pretty
yes,
cool.
and that's what we love is that at every book signing, someone will come up and tell us, you need to call so and so, or you need to hear
Yeah.
what I learned in such and such. And we talked to a gentleman who had been one of the worked on Air Force One when Kennedy was president, and he verified. He said, yes, Marilyn Monroe was on Air Force One at one time that I know
Hmm.
of, because he said I saw her. And
Yeah.
she signed on as a secretary because everyone had to sign on with a name, and she used a fake one and put that her role was a secretary. And I said, well, was she wearing a dark wig or anything? And he said, no, it was Marilyn, blonde hair and all.
That's funny. I hadn't heard that one either. Unfortunately, we are bumping up towards the end here. The book, The Lone Star Speaks: The Untold Texas Stories About the JFK Assassination, is very intriguing. It's available on Amazon. There's a link to it in the description. And yeah, I mean, if you're into learning about this, or if this might be your first read on it, it's definitely something for you to check out and to learn more about. Katana, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And thank you for listening and subscribing to Learning More. We encourage you and thank you for rating this podcast and sharing it with your friends. And as with any podcast that gives medical or legal opinion, the information is not meant to substitute professional advice. We encourage you to consult a professional to discuss your exact needs. I'm not sure I needed a disclaimer on the JFK episode. We didn't really give much medical opinion on this one. Hey, but it's one of those shows where we're changing topics each week. We learn something new every single week, and I hope you are enjoying it, and I hope you do subscribe, as I mentioned. Again, thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. I'm Russ, and I look forward to learning more with you next time.